Hello, my name is Johnny Jupiter, and I grew up here, Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham has always had people who try to remember as far back as they can and tell stories. And some of these stories put a chill down my spine, kept me awake at nights and out of certain parts of town after sunset. These are the facts as I have discovered them, along with the stories as I have been told them. This is Scary Stories from the Magic City. Our next story comes from the east side of Birmingham, and it is a truly frightening piece of early Birmingham history. This is a story of when evil comes to surface. Steam, lust, and rust. The stories of the Hawes murders. The when is 1888. The where is Eastlake Park. The reason why is because the young steam town of Birmingham is about to be rocked by the trial of the century, and as this dark shadow passes through, it will claim many lives with violence. Eastlake Park was built in 1886 by the Eastlake Land Company. It was a private 100-acre park with a 45-acre man-made lake. It was a booming, heavily segregated theme park. It included a hotel resort, a dance pavilion, something called pleasure boats, which were paddled boats with canopies for privacy, not to mention a zoo. African Americans were only allowed to enter the park as minstrel entertainers who performed at the Eastlake Aquatic Amphitheater and Casino. It was a booming attraction in a young industrial town. Then one morning, the morning of December the 4th, 1888, two young teenage boys, John Keith and Ben Colson, were fishing on a boat when they came across a naked body, the body of a young girl floating in the water. Police arrive and discover the body of a 6 or 7-year-old girl. The child's face was so distorted it was beyond recognition. Police declared it a case of murder. The small young metropolis was soon all abuzz with this horrible crime, and it caused quite a sensation. The girl's body was taken to Lockwood and Miller's funeral parlor, where the body was put on display in hopes of someone identifying the child. Teachers even let school out early, so as entire classes of small children all over the city could participate in the viewing in hopes of identifying the child's body. Thousands of people viewed this little girl's body, and yet it was not until the next day that a butcher was able to identify her as Maye Hawes, daughter of Emma and Richard Hawes. Richard and Emma Hawes were in a dysfunctional marriage. Richard, who worked as a train engineer for Georgia Pacific Railways, eloped with Emma Pettis, daughter of Colonel Pettis, when she was only 18 years old in Atlanta, Georgia. Richard claims that Emma was unfaithful to him consistently throughout their marriage. And when confronted about her infidelities, they would both agree to try and work things out, which usually meant moving to a new town. The Hawes moved from Atlanta to Montgomery, and then once again back to Birmingham, Alabama, in a period of less than 4 years. Richard and Emma had a son, Willie, who was born in 1886, the same year Mr. Hawes claimed to have filed for a divorce on grounds of infidelity, a claim that was disputed to have never been officialized. Young Willie was sent to live with Richard's brother in Atlanta. As police began to investigate, they discovered mixed stories. Some of Mrs. Hawes' acquaintances claimed that the couple was still indeed married, while others in town believed that Mr. Hawes had quietly divorced Mrs. Hawes as not to shame her. Emma Hawes was well known to be an alcoholic. Many reports suggest that Maye Hawes, 7 years old, had to care for herself and her younger sister Irene, 6 years old. This may not be entirely true. Many stories attribute help for the little girls to have been provided by a mixed-race woman who has been called everything from a neighbor to a servant named Fanny Bryant, a mysterious figure with no searchable records, who lived with her domestic partner, Albert Patterson. Interracial marriages were illegal at the time in Alabama. Fanny was known to do the cooking and the cleaning for Emma Hawes. In what capacity, however, still remains disputed. As police began to investigate further and question the neighbors, they discovered that the mother, Emma Hawes, and the youngest daughter, Irene, were still missing. Some neighbors told police that Mr. Hawes had recently left to Columbus, Mississippi to remarry. Fanny Bryant was heavily questioned by the police and made a suspect, suggesting that she murdered this family for financial gain of what was later identified as money for child support. While interrogated by police, Fanny explained that Mr. Hawes had recently visited the house the weekend before young May's body was found floating atop East Lake. Fanny says that Richard and May were helping Mrs. Hawes pack a suitcase, saying she was going on a trip Fanny explained she thought meant to Atlanta. While investigating the home, police discovered a little girl's clothes, bloody and partially burned, still in the Hawes' fireplace. Shortly after questioning neighbors, police received a message from a local Birmingham newspaper. The message was that Mr. Hawes had indeed just married a woman, a Mrs. May's Story, from Columbus, Mississippi, and he was leaving Mississippi headed to Atlanta. Birmingham police were waiting at the train stop, and when the train stopped in Birmingham, police boarded it. They arrested Mr. Hawes, who was still wearing his wedding suit, for murder. While he was being escorted off the train, the Weekly H Herald printed that Mr. Hawes, quote, asked no questions as to which of his children he was accused of murdering, nor did he express any desire to see their remains. All he said on the way to jail was that he was innocent, end quote. In a search for more concrete, less circumstantial evidence, police began to search Eastlake Park and also the historical Birmingham Lakeview district. By this time, the media went crazy. The story had gone nationwide thanks to newspapers such as the Weekly H Herald. The whole nation was watching Birmingham, and the government at that time was concerned about this hurting the image of this booming city, or perhaps its economy. While in jail, Mr. Hawes wrote several letters to his recent bride, Mrs. May's Story Hawes, to ask her to forgive him for not claiming Irene and May as his children. Apparently, he had told her about his marriage and divorce from Emma, and told her that Willie was his son, never making mention of the two little girls. Richard Hawes explained to the police that he never mentioned them because they were going to a convent. Police interrogated Mr. Hawes heavily. While in jail, he protested that he did not commit the crime and he knew nothing about it. Police received a tip from a streetcar driver. A tip that a man matching the description of Richard Hawes was seen the night before the body was found, and with a little girl riding the trolley to Eastlake Park from Lakeview Park, which is now the site of the Highland Golf Course. After searching Eastlake Park and dragging the lake a few times, the police found nothing relating to Mr. Hawes. They did, however, find a fresh grave with a small African-American female inside. The case was overshadowed by Maye Hawes' murder and the disappearance of Emma and Irene Hawes. It seemed to draw all of the police's attention. And after unearthing a buried bloody hatchet with a piece of torn ribbon, police then decided to drag the lake 3 times until they found the violently assaulted body of Emma and Irene Hawes. Detective Kieran discovered the bodies around noon, about 60 feet away from where the boats were locked up and docked at night. The owner of pleasure boats said that there were obvious signs of forced entry, with a broken lock and a stolen boat floating in the lake right where the bodies were found. Emma's body was held to the bottom with over 50 pounds of railroad scrap iron. She was bound by her own window curtain, by her neck, her waist, and her feet. The coroner determined it was blunt trauma to the back of her head that killed Emma Hawes. After the bodies were discovered in such a horrible and gruesome way, the public was already bubbling hot and furious at Richard Hawes. They wanted police to deliver him into the hands of the mob. Non-stop media coverage of what became the seemingly greatest scandal was in the news night and day, might have drove the citizens to unrest. The Weekly H Herald and the Atlanta Constitution were printing some dark and lurid articles about the case at the time. Sheriff Joseph S. Smith had to ask for the local militia's help in fortifying the jail, as a large angry mob of more than 1,500 people began to demand that Hawes be released from the jail into the hands of the people for justice. The mob got restless. Sheriff Smith armed all of his deputies. with shotguns and told them to guard the perimeter of the jail and start shooting if the mob tried to rush past them in an alley behind the jail. And the crowd did. So Sheriff Smith warned the crowd to move back, and he counted to 5. Then he opened fire. The Alabama Sentinel reported that the police opened fire on mostly unarmed citizens, and a majority of these were shot in the back as citizens began to flee the spray of bullets. 10 died, including the postman, Maurice Throckmorton. A jury made up of entirely white males ages 28 to 47 convicted Richard Hawes in 55 minutes of deliberation. He was sentenced to death. His last month in jail, he confessed that he had hired a hitman to kill Emma and Irene Hawes, but said when he discovered that Maye Hawes knew too much, she had to die too. Richard Hawes confessed to killing his 7-year-old daughter himself. After intoxicating her with alcohol, he confessed to beating her naked body before tossing it into the lake. On February 28, 1890, Sheriff Joseph F. Smith executed Richard Hawes. The good people of Birmingham were selling tickets. Tickets were reported to be as high as $200, in a time when a loaf of bread was 3 cents. The scaffolding to hang Mr. Hawes was built by Mr. J. A. Griffith, who also served on his jury. Fanny Bryant and Albert Patterson were also sentenced to death for their believed involvement in the case, even as no evidence ever did surface to link the two to the actual murders. Fanny Bryant died in a prison riot just before her execution, and after her death, Albert Patterson turned state evidence against Richard Hawes. A lot of questions remain unanswered to this day about the Hawes murders. What was the real nature of the relationship with Fanny Bryant? Was she there to help or to hurt this family? Why was she so close to the children? Why did she have May with her when her mother was killed? Or did Richard Hawes act alone? Could his confession been out of duress? Could he have been set up by someone? Why would Hawes have the body of his wife and child hidden so very close to his family home? What happened to young Willie Hawes? Did he remain in Atlanta with his uncle? Why was Willie separated from his family in the first place? Another theory to the Hawes murders suggests that perhaps due to Mrs. Hawes' infidelity, all of the Hawes children were not fathered by Richard Hawes. That could explain why the children were divided by a state's worth of distance, and perhaps it could explain how Hawes could kill the child if he had knowledge of her true paternity. Could that have been a factor? Why did he tell his bride that his only child was Willie? Was he lying, or just telling pieces of the truth? Did Richard Hawes brutally murder his family? He confessed to it. He died for it. But did he really do it, or was he responsible for their deaths? Over time, Birmingham has built over, drained, and removed all points of interest related to this case, except for Eastlake Park, which many claim to still be haunted by little Maye Hawes to this day. Some call her the Mermaid of Eastlake. It is believed if you set a flower, a chrysanthemum, on the water, that Maye Hawes will recover it.